Close your eyes and imagine a world without the modern rhythms of childhood. No school bells, no playground laughter, no brightly colored toys scattered across a bedroom floor. Instead, picture a village path of dirt and mud leading to low-roofed houses of timber and stone, their chimneys breathing out thin trails of smoke into the cold air. Beyond them stretch open fields, endless forests, and a silence broken only by the bleating of animals, the crack of a cartwheel, or the cry of a distant crow. This is the medieval world, raw, harsh, and unrelenting. For children born into this world, the notion of childhood as we understand it today simply did not exist. In our modern era, we often treat childhood as a protected season of innocence, a time for play, curiosity, and gentle learning. But in the Middle Ages, children were seen not as fragile beings to be sheltered, but as smaller, weaker versions of adults, expected to work, contribute, and endure the hardships of life from an early age. The softness of childhood, that tender cushion of years we now consider sacred, was instead pressed into service by necessity. It is easy centuries later to romanticize the medieval village, to imagine golden harvest fields, bright church festivals, or the laughter of children chasing one another through the market square. And yes, such moments of joy and celebration did exist. Yet, threaded beneath them was a reality far more sobering. Childhood was brief, fragile, and often perilous. A boy or girl might never live past their first decade, claimed by illness, hunger, or accident. And if they did survive, the world demanded that they take on burdens that bent their backs and calloused their hands long before they reached maturity. Picture for a moment a boy of 6 years rising before dawn in a peasant's cottage. The hearth has gone cold during the night, and the thin blanket on his straw mattress has done little to keep him warm. He pulls on a rough woolen tunic, far too big for him, handed down from an older brother. There is no time to linger. His father has already gone to the fields, and his mother is calling him to carry water from the village well. The pail is heavy, the path slippery, and every stumble risks a bruised knee, or worse. For this boy, there is no gentle easing into responsibility. The weight of survival presses upon him from the start. Now imagine a girl of 8, her small hands raw from hours of spinning flax into thread. She sits on a low stool in the dim light of the cottage window, her task endless, her fingers catching on coarse fibers. To pause too long, to fumble, or to make mistakes, risks not only her family's anger, but also the loss of vital material needed for clothing or trade. Her childhood is measured not in games or schooling, but in spools of thread and aching joints. The medieval worldview left little space for what we would now call childhood rights. To the people of the time, survival outweighed sentiment. Life was precarious. Famine, plague, and war lurked always at the edge of the horizon. Every member of the household had to contribute. Even the youngest, a child's small size made them useful for certain tasks, crawling into tight spaces, scaring away birds from fields, or carrying out chores that adults deemed too menial or exhausting. And while parents no doubt loved their children, their affection was often tempered by necessity. A child who did not pull their weight threatened the family's survival. There was also the grim reality of mortality. In many regions of medieval Europe, nearly half of all children did not survive beyond the age of 5. Disease claimed them swiftly, with little recourse. Families who endured such losses often hardened themselves, placing less emphasis on cherishing a stage of life so often cut short. The modern idea of protecting childhood innocence simply did not fit into the medieval framework of survival. And yet, within these shadows, children were still children. They laughed, they played, they invented games with stones and sticks, sang songs, and found moments of wonder in their harsh surroundings. A group of boys might chase one another down a village lane, their bare feet kicking up dust. A girl might weave a crown of wildflowers even as she carried a basket of laundry to the river. The human spirit is resilient, and even in the darkest times, childhood found a way to shine, however faintly. But it is important to remember that behind these glimpses of innocence lay the constant presence of danger. To be a child in the medieval world was to live in the shadow of work, duty, and risk. Whether born to a peasant family, destined for the fields, apprenticed to a craftsman in a bustling town, or even raised within the walls of a noble estate, a child's path was almost always lined with responsibility. To modern eyes, their burdens seem impossibly heavy. But to the medieval world, this was simply the order of things. This script will take us through those burdens, job by job, duty by duty, to explore the many dangerous roles children undertook. We will walk with them into the soot-filled chimneys, the claustrophobic mines, the endless fields, the crowded kitchens, and the perilous streets. We will stand with them on the decks of ships, beneath the weight of armor, and beside the cold river banks, where laundry was beaten against stone. Through each chapter, we will uncover how children's lives were shaped by labor, risk, and necessity, and how their small bodies bore the weight of a world that never paused for youth. By the end, we may come to see that the story of medieval childhood is not merely one of suffering, but also of resilience. For though history often forgets them, the children of the Middle Ages played a vital role in keeping families, villages, and even entire kingdoms alive. Their struggles echo through time, reminding us of how far we have come, and how fragile the gift of childhood truly is. So as you listen, allow the modern world to fade, let the images of neon lights, rushing traffic, and screens dissolve. Step instead into the narrow lanes of a medieval town, the smoky haze of a cottage, the echoing silence of a mine shaft. See the children there, their faces lit by firelight or pale moon, their eyes wide with both fear and determination. For this is their story, the story of childhood in an age of shadows, when innocence was fragile and survival demanded sacrifice. The dawn breaks pale and cold over a medieval town. The streets are narrow, the roofs high and slanted, and from behind shuttered windows drifts the faint smell of wood smoke. As the bells of the parish church toll, the town begins to stir. Bakers roll dough, blacksmiths stoke their forges, and merchants open their stalls. In this bustling world, children are not idle spectators. Many of them, still no more than 7 or 8 years old, step into a life that will shape their futures, the life of an apprentice. Apprenticeship was in many ways the bridge between childhood and adulthood in the Middle Ages. It was a contract sometimes written, often sealed by word of mouth, that bound a young child to a master craftsman. The master promised training, food and shelter. The child in return promised years of obedience, service, and labor. To modern ears this may sound like a fair exchange, a chance to learn a trade that could one day secure independence. But the reality was far more complex and far more punishing. Imagine a boy of 9, his clothes patched and worn, being led by his parents through the crowded marketplace. They stop before the workshop of a blacksmith. Inside, sparks fly from the anvil as the master hammers a glowing rod of iron into shape. The heat of the forge radiates outward, searing the air. The boy's parents speak quietly with the smith, bargaining, pleading, agreeing, and then with a handshake and perhaps a coin, the boy's future is sealed. He is no longer under the daily care of his parents. From this moment on, he belongs to the workshop. The life of an apprentice was grueling. Days began before sunrise. The apprentice swept the floors, carried water, fetched firewood, and prepared the tools before the master even raised his hammer. Only after these endless chores could training begin, and training was rarely gentle. A master expected his apprentices to watch, imitate, and endure. Mistakes were not tolerated. A misaligned strike of the hammer could mean a sharp rebuke, or worse, the sting of a rod across the back. For apprentices, discipline was as much a part of learning as the craft itself. The hours stretched long, often from dawn until well after dusk. A child apprenticed to a carpenter might spend the day hauling heavy planks, sharpening tools on the grindstone, or planing rough boards until his arms ached. A young girl apprenticed to a seamstress might prick her fingers raw, sewing fine stitches, her eyes straining in the dim candlelight. Each task demanded patience and precision, yet also carried its risks. A slip of the hand could cause cuts, burns, or broken bones. For children still growing into their strength, these dangers were constant companions. Yet apprenticeships were not limited to the hard trades of smiths and carpenters. In towns and cities, nearly every craft and guild required young workers. Bakers needed apprentices to knead dough and tend ovens, often in sweltering heat. Masons trained boys to haul stones, mix mortar, and climb precarious scaffolding. Even the delicate art of painting or gilding required apprentices who ground pigments, prepared canvases, and practiced under the sharp gaze of masters. Every craft, noble or humble, was built on the backs of children bound to years of service. Apprenticeship contracts often lasted 7 years, a span that must have felt like a lifetime to a child. During this time, apprentices were expected to live with their masters, cut off from the comfort of family and the playfulness of youth. They ate at the master's table, slept in lofts or corners of the workshop, and followed strict rules of obedience. In some households, apprentices were treated kindly, as part of the family. In others they were little better than servants, enduring hunger, harsh words, and frequent beatings. And yet the system endured because it offered something rare, the promise of a future. A successful apprenticeship could mean mastery of a trade, acceptance into a guild, and the chance to one day open a shop of one's own. In a world where survival often depended on skill, this was no small reward. Parents often gave up their children to apprenticeships, not out of cruelty, but out of hope that their sons or daughters might find stability and dignity beyond the fields. But for every apprentice who rose to mastery, countless others fell short. Some ran away, unable to endure the hardship. Others were dismissed for disobedience or incompetence. And many more simply labored through their years, emerging not as masters, but as lifelong journeymen, wandering from town to town, forever dependent on others for work. For children, the dream of apprenticeship was always shadowed by the risk of failure. There was also danger hidden within the very work itself. Blacksmiths' apprentices risked burns from molten metal. Bakers' apprentices might collapse from the suffocating heat of ovens. Masons' apprentices often suffered broken bones from falling stones or scaffolding. Even trades that seemed gentle, like weaving or embroidery, strained the body and dimmed the eyes with endless hours of repetitive labor. A child's small frame was not spared from adult dangers. In fact, it was often placed directly in their path. Consider too the emotional burden. For a child separated from home at 7 or 8, the absence of family must have been a wound that never fully healed. The comforting voice of a mother, the playful companionship of siblings, the familiar corners of home, all were exchanged for the stern commands of a master and the relentless grind of work. Loneliness and homesickness were silent burdens, carried by apprentices, seldom spoken of but deeply felt. And yet, despite all of this, apprenticeships did more than crush. They also forged resilience. Some children found pride in their growing skills, joy in small victories, and friendship with fellow apprentices who shared the same struggles. They carved out identities within their trades, earning a sense of purpose that was rare in a world that demanded constant labor. To plane a board smoothly, to stitch a perfect seam, to strike iron with precision. These were moments of triumph, however small, that illuminated the dark path of apprenticeship. In time those who endured could rise. A boy who began by sweeping the smithy might one day forge swords admired by knights. A girl who stitched hems for a seamstress might one day craft gowns for nobles. Apprenticeship was dangerous, grueling and often cruel, but it also held within it the fragile seed of opportunity, the hope that through suffering, a child could step into adulthood with a skill that might protect them from poverty. So when we think of apprenticeships in the Middle Ages, we must see them clearly. They were not simply schools of craft, nor mere training grounds for industry. They were crucibles, places where childhood was burned away in the fires of labor, leaving behind either the strength of a craftsman or the broken spirit of one who could not endure. As we leave the dim workshops of apprenticeships and step further into the shadows of medieval childhood, we will descend into even darker places, the chimneys, mines and streets where children's small bodies were thrust into labor too dangerous even for grown men. The hearth was the heart of every medieval home. Its fire gave warmth through the long winters, boiled the pots that fed families, and lit the darkness when candles burned too quickly, or wax was scarce. But that fire, comforting as it was, demanded a hidden cost. Behind the stone walls and chimneys, soot gathered in thick, choking layers, ash clung to the flues like black moss, and smoke, unable to escape, crept back into rooms, staining walls and threatening to suffocate all within. A chimney could not be left untended for long, and so someone had to climb inside, scrape the soot away, and restore the breath of the house. That someone was often a child. The work of the chimney sweep was not one of choice, but of necessity. Adults, broad-shouldered and grown, could not fit into the narrow shafts that twisted upward through stone and brick. Only children, small, thin and light, could crawl into spaces scarcely wider than their own bodies, and so from the humblest cottages to the grandest manors, it was children who were sent into the darkness. Their size, once the symbol of youth, became the very reason they were exploited. Imagine for a moment, a boy no older than 6 or 7, his clothes are little more than rags, already darkened with soot that never washes out. His face is smudged black, his hair matted. He stands before a yawning chimney mouth, the tools of his trade beside him, a brush, a scraper, a small bag to collect what he can. His master, often an older sweep, who owned the rights to his labor, orders him to begin. With a sigh too heavy for such a small body, the child kneels, places his hands on the cold stone, and crawls into the abyss. Inside the chimney, the air is close and suffocating. Darkness presses in from all sides. The boy wriggles forward, scraping soot with his brush, coughing as particles swirl around him like black snow. Each movement is slow, deliberate, for there is no room to stretch or turn freely. His knees bruise against rough stone, his elbows scrape raw. The further he climbs, the tighter the shaft becomes, until his body feels wedged, his chest compressed, his breath shallow. Panic is a constant shadow. One wrong shift, one slip, and he may become stuck forever. The dangers were many, and they were merciless. Chimneys were narrow, often twisted at odd angles, and caked with sharp flakes of hardened soot. A child could become trapped halfway, unable to climb up or down. In such cases, some suffocated where they lay, their cries echoing faintly through the walls until silence claimed them. Others slipped and fell, plummeting into the fire below, or into stone hearths that offered no mercy. Even if they survived the climb, the soot itself carried poison. Inhaling it burned the lungs, leaving children with a constant cough that rattled their thin frames. Many chimney sweeps grew ill with what later centuries would call soot wart, a painful cancer caused by constant exposure. For medieval children, it was simply another hazard of their trade, and yet for many families, there was no alternative. Poor parents, desperate to feed their children, often sold them to master sweeps. These masters, in turn, treated the children as property, binding them into years of service. To run away meant severe punishment. To refuse to climb meant beatings, or worse. Some children were even forced to sleep in soot bags, their beds little more than the filthy remains of their labor, a reminder that they belonged wholly to their masters. Despite the cruelty, chimney sweeps were vital. Without them, houses risked deadly fires or smoke-filled rooms. Wealthy households, with multiple hearths and towering chimneys, required constant sweeping, meaning more children were needed to keep the flames burning safely. The irony was bitter. The same fire that gave warmth and life to a family demanded the suffering of another family's child. There were, of course, moments of fragile camaraderie among the children themselves. Two young sweeps, meeting in a city alley, might exchange a smile, a cough, or a few words of comfort. They shared the same soot-stained fate, the same weary bones. Sometimes they even invented games to lighten their burdens, races to see who could climb fastest, contests of who could endure the longest without coughing. Small joys flickered amid the darkness, proof that even in the harshest conditions, the spirit of childhood clung stubbornly to life. But still the toll was undeniable. Many chimney sweeps grew stunted, their growth slowed by malnutrition and constant strain, their backs bent early, their lungs weakened long before adulthood. Few enjoyed long lives. Their names are seldom remembered, for they left behind little more than a trail of soot, washed away with the rain. As you imagine these children crawling through the narrow arteries of stone, it is easy to feel the claustrophobia, the suffocating silence, the scraping of knees against unyielding walls. This was their world, a world hidden behind the cheerful glow of every hearth fire. To sit by a medieval fireplace, to feel its warmth, was to benefit silently from the unseen labor of a child pressed into its depths. And yet, amid all this suffering, a strange paradox existed. Chimney sweeps were often both despised and pitied. Many townsfolk saw them as dirty, ragged, and lowly. Yet others, aware of their peril, treated them with a superstitious kind of respect, believing a chimney sweep's presence brought luck. To see a child blackened with soot in the marketplace was a reminder both of society's cruelty and its reliance upon the smallest and weakest to do the most dangerous tasks. Let us linger for a moment on the sensory weight of this labor. The smell of smoke never left a sweep's body. It clung to their skin, hair, and clothes. Their fingernails were rimmed black, their eyes often red with irritation. Even water could not wash away the stains completely. The coughs that rattled their chests often lulled them to sleep at night, echoing in the darkness of workshops and cellars where they lay. Childhood laughter still surfaced, faint, fleeting, but always accompanied by the rasp of lungs burdened with soot. When we look back from the safety of our modern world, it is almost unthinkable that children were forced into such work. Yet in the medieval period, as in centuries after, necessity overshadowed compassion. Chimneys had to be cleaned, fires had to burn, and families too poor to resist gave their children to the trade. In this way, the innocence of youth was bartered away, one climb at a time, into the narrow black tunnels of stone. This was the fate of many children, to crawl where no adult could, to labor where no one else dared, and to pay with their bodies for the warmth of others. Their stories remind us that behind every flickering firelight in the Middle Ages, there were shadows shaped by the small figures of children climbing endlessly upward into soot and silence. As we leave the suffocating chimneys behind, our journey into the dangerous jobs of medieval children only deepens. For if the shafts of soot were perilous, the tunnels beneath the earth, the mines were darker still. There in the bowels of the earth, children faced a world without air, without light, and without mercy. Beneath the medieval landscape, below the villages, fields, and forests, stretched another world. It was a world of shadows and silence, where sunlight never reached, and air was heavy with the dust of stone. In this underworld, men labored to pry from the earth its hidden treasures: salt, coal, iron, silver, tin, and lead. But alongside them, often unseen and unremembered, worked children. Their small bodies were deemed perfect for squeezing through passages too narrow for adults, for carrying loads in tunnels where only the thinnest could pass. While life above the ground was harsh, life below it was far worse. Mining was among the most dangerous occupations of the medieval era. Caves collapsed without warning. Poisonous gases seeped through cracks in the rock. Water flooded shafts, drowning those trapped within. The constant strike of pickaxes filled the tunnels with noise, dust, and the ever-present risk of injury. For grown men, these dangers were crushing. For children, they were magnified 100-fold. Imagine a boy of 10, his face smeared with dust, clutching a rough-hewn lantern whose flame flickers weakly against the dark. He is sent into a shaft scarcely wider than his shoulders, ordered to crawl forward on his hands and knees, dragging behind him a sack of ore. The air is thin. Each breath burns in his chest. Ahead, the tunnel bends tighter until he feels the earth pressing against his ribs, his back scraping stone above him. He pushes forward because to stop would mean the master's anger, or worse, to be buried alive if the tunnel collapsed. Children in mines performed many tasks. Some carried ore in baskets strapped to their backs, climbing steep ladders slick with damp earth. Others worked as trappers, responsible for ununting and closing ventilation doors, sitting in pitch darkness for hours, listening only to the creak of wood and the distant rumble of picks. Still others crawled into the smallest crevices to dig where adult miners could not fit. Their hands blistered, their knees bruised, their lungs filled with dust. They were expected to endure without complaint. The conditions were brutal. Lanterns and torches gave off smoke, choking the narrow shafts. Water dripped constantly, turning floors to mud, chilling bodies already weak from hunger. Rats scurried through tunnels, feeding on scraps, sometimes biting at bare feet, and always there was the weight of the earth above, a silent crushing threat. To work in the mines was to know, each day, that the ceiling could collapse at any moment, burying miners alive. For a child, the fear was constant, though often left unspoken. Accidents were common. A loosened stone could strike a child's head, ending a life in an instant. A sudden flood could sweep workers away, drowning them in the darkness. Toxic air, what miners would later call black damp or choke damp, crept silently through shafts, suffocating those who breathed it. Children, with smaller lungs and weaker bodies, succumbed fastest. Sometimes entire crews were lost, their bodies entombed within the very earth they labored to hollow. And yet, despite the dangers, families sent their children into mines because poverty allowed no other choice. Mining was steady work compared to farming, and though the wages were meager, they offered a lifeline. Parents desperate to keep hunger from their doors, placed their sons and sometimes their daughters into the service of mine owners. It was a grim bargain. Risk a child's life below ground in the hope that the family might survive above it. There were deeper injustices still. Many children were not simply laborers, but bound servants, trapped by debt, or forced into service by lords who owned the mines. In such cases, escape was nearly impossible. To run meant punishment, to resist meant starvation. These children belonged to the earth as much as the ore they carried. Imagine again that boy of 10. His shift stretches for endless hours, the darkness broken only by the dim glow of his lantern. His clothes are soaked from dripping water, his hands raw and swollen, clutch at the heavy basket on his back. Each step is agony, but he climbs rung by rung up a crude wooden ladder. Below him another child waits, shifting impatiently, their faces both pale and hollow from the same endless toil. Above, the faint light of the surface gleams, but it might as well be the sun in the heavens, distant, untouchable, a world away. Health suffered quickly in such conditions. Constant exposure to dust scarred young lungs, leading to a deep rattling cough. Limbs grew bowed from hauling heavy loads before their bones had hardened. Eyes strained in the poor light, leaving many partially blind before adulthood. Malnutrition was common, for miners were often fed little more than bread, porridge or thin broth. Childhood growth was stunted, bodies bent before they had fully matured, and yet, as with apprenticeships and chimney sweeping, there were moments of human resilience. In the pauses between labor, children whispered stories to one another in the dark, creating fragile bonds of friendship. They shared stale crusts of bread, offered comfort when one of their number was injured, and sometimes sang to break the crushing silence. Even in the blackness of the mines, the spark of childhood refused to be extinguished completely. Still, the toll was merciless. Many children did not live to see adulthood. Those who survived bore scars, physical and invisible, for life. Some carried twisted spines, bowed legs, or failing lungs. Others carried memories of companions lost, of tunnels collapsing, of screams swallowed by earth. The mines did not merely claim bodies, they carved away the lightness of youth, replacing it with a weary knowledge of mortality. To the medieval world, however, such suffering was invisible. The wealth of towns and lords depended on the minerals dragged from the earth. Silver paid for coins, iron forged weapons, salt preserved food. Every glimmer of wealth above the surface was purchased by the labor of countless miners below, including children whose names would never appear in the records. Their sacrifice was swallowed by history, just as surely as the earth swallowed their voices. For us looking back across centuries, the image is haunting: a child, lantern in hand, disappearing into a shaft so narrow, it seems to close around him, the darkness absolute, the air heavy with dust. He is one of many, forgotten by name, remembered only in the faint traces of records that speak of child miners and their endless toil. His story, like so many others, lingers in silence, a reminder of how easily youth was sacrificed for survival. As we leave the mines, climbing back into the light of the medieval surface world, we may feel a strange relief, a breath of air that the children below seldom tasted. Yet the journey through dangerous child labor does not end here. Above the ground, in the rolling fields and wide countryside, another kind of toil awaited. Children were driven into the farms and harvests, where fragile hands struggled against the unyielding demands of the land. If the mines consumed children in darkness, the farmlands demanded them in light. Across the medieval countryside, stretching from England's rolling hills to the wide plains of Europe, fields were the beating heart of survival. Grain for bread, vegetables for stews, hay for animals, all depended on the rhythms of planting and harvest. And while adults bent their backs to the soil, children were never far behind, expected to share in the burden. In many ways, the farm was a classroom of labor. From the moment a child could walk, work became part of daily life. At first tasks were small, scattering seed, scaring birds from fields with clappers or rattles, gathering kindling for the hearth. But as years passed, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. By the age of 7 or 8, many children labored nearly as long as their parents, their fragile hands struggling with tools too large, their thin arms straining against loads too heavy. Unlike the mines, where darkness swallowed all, the fields stretched wide beneath the open sky, yet the work was no less exhausting. In spring, children helped with planting, carrying seed bags, following plows to scatter grain, pressing soil with bare feet. In summer they tended animals, drove oxen or fetched water from distant streams. And when autumn came, the great harvest arrived, the season on which survival itself depended. Here the smallest hands were drawn into the greatest toil. Imagine a girl of 9, standing in a field of wheat taller than her shoulders. The sun beats down, hot and merciless, as she bends again and again to gather bundles of cut stalks. Her fingers are blistered from clutching rough stems. She ties each bundle with a twisted cord of straw, her back aching, though the day has only begun. Around her, voices call, scythes whistle through the air, and wagons creak under the weight of the harvest. Every moment counts, for a single storm could ruin months of labor. Children's work was essential during these weeks. They stooped to collect fallen grain, gleaned stray stalks from the soil, and hauled sheaves to the carts. Some drove horses or oxen, guiding heavy wagons across uneven ground. Others worked late into the evening, carrying baskets of vegetables, berries, or fruit, their small bodies swaying with fatigue. Even the very young were expected to chase away crows or guard fields from wandering animals. In such moments, childhood gave way to necessity, and play was a luxury rarely permitted. The labor was punishing on young bodies. Long hours under the sun led to dehydration and heat exhaustion. Bare feet blistered in the stubble of cut grain. Backs bent too early. Knees weakened from carrying heavy loads. Winter brought little relief, for children fed animals, chopped wood, and hauled water through frost and snow. Every season had its demands, and every demand fell on both adult and child alike. Yet farming was more than drudgery. In its rhythms lay moments of shared community. During harvest, entire villages often worked side by side, fields alive with the clamor of voices and tools. Children, though exhausted, shared in the rare spirit of festivity that accompanied successful gathering. Songs were sung to pace the labor, and at the day's end families sometimes feasted together on bread, cheese, and ale. For a brief moment, the burden lightened, and children glimpsed the warmth of belonging that the land could also provide. But such moments did little to ease the broader reality. Farming was unpredictable. A child might labor for weeks in planting, only to see the crop wither in drought or rot in endless rain. Famine haunted the medieval world, and when it came, it struck children first and hardest. Malnourished bodies, weakened further under the strain of work. Those too frail to continue were often left behind, while stronger siblings were pushed harder to compensate. The land gave, but it also took away, and children bore its demands without choice. Many children also worked with animals. Herding sheep and cattle was a common duty, often requiring hours of solitude in distant pastures. Picture a boy of 8, staff in hand, standing on a windswept hill, his only companions the flock at his feet. He must guard them from wolves, thieves, or wandering into danger. Loneliness was his constant companion, broken only when he whittled wood, hummed a tune, or called to other shepherd children across the hills. Though the task was less physically exhausting than harvesting, it demanded vigilance, patience, and endurance, qualities that childhood was expected to acquire far too soon. The risks of farming were subtler than in mines, but no less real. Scythes could cut deep wounds. Horses and oxen sometimes trampled children underfoot. Rivers crossed in search of water carried the danger of drowning. Disease spread quickly in close quarters, especially among animals. Every day carried the possibility of injury or loss, and yet the work continued, unbroken by concern for those too small to bear it. And still children found ways to carve meaning from their toil. Some learned the knowledge of the earth directly, how to tell when rain was coming, by the smell of the soil, how to read the growth of plants, how to soothe a restless animal. This apprenticeship to the land was unpaid, but invaluable, and in time, those who survived childhood often became the farmers who fed the next generation. The balance of hardship and knowledge is what makes medieval agricultural childhood so haunting. It was not merely a story of suffering, but of endurance and inheritance. Fields demanded their strength, yet also shaped their understanding of life's cycles, birth and death, hunger and feast, seed and harvest. Through sweat and tears, children absorbed the ancient rhythm of survival, even as it wore their bodies thin. As dusk fell on the fields, weary children often returned home with aching limbs, their hands still marked by straw and earth. In cottages dimly lit by fire, they might eat a small meal, fall asleep on straw pallets, and rise at dawn to begin again. Rest was brief, play scarcer still. The farm absorbed every moment, every breath, every ounce of strength that young bodies could muster. The image remains clear, a field of golden wheat, a child bent among the stalks, sweat shining on a sunburned brow, hands swollen from labor. The landscape is vast, yet the child seems small within it, fragile but essential. Without such hands, the harvest would falter. Without such sacrifices, medieval villages could not survive. From the fields our journey into dangerous child labor continues. For beyond crops and animals, there were other tasks waiting, crafts and trades where children's nimble fingers were prized, but their safety ignored. In workshops and city streets, new perils emerged, demanding new sacrifices. The story moves now from the wide fields of the countryside to the crowded alleys of towns, where guilds, masters, and apprentices shaped the lives of young workers. The countryside shaped children with soil and harvest, but the towns and cities molded them in fire, iron, and craft. If the fields demanded endurance, the workshops demanded obedience. Medieval towns were alive with the sounds of labor, the clang of blacksmiths, the hiss of tanners, the whir of looms, the scrape of cobblers' knives, and within these crowded spaces, children found themselves drawn into trades that promised skill and survival, yet offered danger at every turn. The system that bound them was called apprenticeship. To modern ears, the word suggests patient teaching, careful instruction, and eventual mastery. But in medieval times, apprenticeship was far harsher. Families often sent their children, sometimes as young as 7, to live with a master craftsman. The child left home not only to learn a trade, but to serve in near total submission. For years, sometimes decades, apprentices ate, slept, and worked under the strict control of their master, bound by contract, custom, and necessity. Imagine the moment a boy of 10 leaves his village, clutching a small bundle of clothes, his mother weeping quietly as he disappears down the road toward town. He does not know if he will ever return. His new home will be a workshop that smells of smoke, leather, or dye. His companions will be other apprentices, sometimes friendly, sometimes cruel, and his life will be governed by endless tasks, sweeping floors, stoking fires, running errands, all before he is allowed to touch the tools of the craft. Each trade carried its own dangers. In the smithy, sparks flew from glowing metal, burning unprotected skin. Apprentices worked the bellows, pumping air into the forge until their arms ached, or held tongs to steady red-hot iron, while the master struck with his hammer. One mistake could mean a searing wound, a scar carried for life. The heat, the noise, and the constant threat of fire pressed on every child who entered the forge. In the tanner's yard, the air itself was poison, hides soaked in vats of water, lime and animal urine. The stench clung to every breath. Children stirred the vats with sticks or hauled heavy skins across slippery floors. Chemicals burned their skin, and diseases bred in the foul water. Yet leather was essential, for shoes, belts, harnesses, and so children labored there, sacrificing health to keep the town supplied. Weavers and spinners faced a different rhythm. In workshops filled with the clatter of looms, children learned to card wool, spin thread, and tend machinery. The work required nimble fingers and endless patience. Long hours bent over frames left backs hunched and eyes strained in dim light. Mistakes meant harsh punishment, for wasted cloth was wasted profit. Even so, textiles drew countless children into their world, for cloth was wealth, and towns depended on its production. Not all apprenticeships involved tools. Many children were sent into service within households, apprenticed to cooks, bakers, or merchants. In the bakery, they rose before dawn to knead dough, tend ovens, and carry heavy sacks of flour. Burns were common, exhaustion constant. In shops they swept, measured, fetched and guarded goods, often standing long hours with little rest. Though less visibly dangerous than a forge or tannery, these roles were relentless, shaping children into silent laborers who sustained the economy of the town. The contract of apprenticeship promised eventual reward. After years of service, often 7 or more, a child might become a journeyman, able to earn wages and practice the trade. If fortune favored them, they could rise to the rank of master, join a guild, and one day take apprentices of their own. But the path was narrow and fraught with risk. Many children never completed their term. Some fled abuse, others died of disease or injury. A few succeeded, but the cost was high, and the journey long. Life under a master was strict, even brutal. Discipline was maintained with little mercy. A child who disobeyed could be beaten. One who failed at a task might be starved or humiliated. Masters often saw apprentices, not as children, but as cheap labor, bound by contract. Families had little power to intervene once the child was handed over. For the apprentice, obedience was survival. Yet within this severity lay a paradox. Apprenticeships, harsh as they were, also provided skills that could lift a child from poverty. A boy who survived years in a blacksmith's forge might emerge with the knowledge to fashion tools, weapons, or horseshoes, skills always in demand. A girl apprenticed to a weaver could master patterns and dyes, perhaps one day managing looms of her own. The same system that exploited children also offered them a narrow ladder upward, though only the strongest climbed it. The dangers, however, never vanished. Fires consumed workshops, dye vats toppled, blades slipped, disease spread quickly in crowded towns. Apprentices worked long before safety or hygiene were considered. Their lives were expendable to many masters, their suffering invisible to all but those who shared it. And yet apprentices formed bonds. In workshops filled with labor, children found companionship in shared hardship. They whispered stories while carding wool, joked while hauling skins, sang while sweeping floors. These small moments of humanity softened the harshness of their world. Sometimes apprentices formed lifelong friendships, remembering the years of toil as a shared crucible that bound them together. Towns and guilds, too, shaped this world. Guilds promised order, quality, and protection for masters, but rarely for children. Rules dictated wages, products, and rights, yet apprentices remained at the bottom. Some guilds enforced contracts that prevented apprentices from leaving abusive masters, trapping them in misery. Others required children to prove skill through grueling tests before granting journeyman status. To the guild, the apprentice was less a child and more an investment, a future craftsman in training whose suffering was a necessary step in the chain of production. Picture the streets of a medieval town, narrow, crowded, filled with smoke and clamor. Along the alleys, workshops spill their labor into the open, hammering, tanning, weaving, baking. Among them, children hurry with baskets, tools and water, darting between wagons and animals, their faces smudged with ash or flour. Each carries the weight of survival, each bound to a master or a craft, each walking the long, uncertain path of apprenticeship. The contrast with the farm could not be sharper. In the countryside, children bent to the soil, shaped by seasons. In the towns they bent to tools, shaped by masters. Both labors consumed childhood, both demanded strength beyond years, both carried danger. Yet the city added its own perils: crowded streets, polluted air, endless noise, and the crushing weight of contracts that bound children as tightly as chains. Still, some found pride in what they learned. An apprentice baker might one day craft bread that fed a town. A young smith might forge the nails that held ships together. Their small hands left marks on the world, even if their names were forgotten. The paradox endured: exploitation and education, suffering and skill, hardship and hope, all entwined in the life of a child apprentice. As night fell, workshops grew quiet. Apprentices slept on straw near the tools they served, their dreams shaped by the day's labor. Some dreamed of mastery, others only of escape. For many the future was uncertain, but the present was always the same: labor, obedience, survival. Childhood in the world of medieval trades was not a time of freedom. It was a contract written in sweat, sealed in exhaustion, and enforced by necessity. From the crafts and trades of towns, our story moves deeper still, to the world of households and nobility, where children became servants, pages and squires. Here danger wore a different face, less the sting of tools, more the peril of power and hierarchy. The tale of medieval child labor now turns from the forge and loom to the castle hall, where fragile youth met the demands of service to the great. From the bustling workshops of towns, the story of childhood labor enters another world entirely: the echoing stone halls of castles and manors, where lords and ladies dined in splendor, while children toiled in silence. If apprenticeship was bound by contract, and farm work by survival, then service in noble houses was bound by power itself, power that demanded obedience, loyalty, and invisibility. For many children, especially those of poor families, becoming a servant in a noble household was not a choice but a necessity. Parents placed their sons and daughters into service, hoping they might at least be fed, clothed and sheltered, even if it meant separation. For the nobles, these children were not guests but tools, extra hands to sweep, scrub, carry, and wait. To serve was to vanish into the background, to move quietly behind tapestries and along shadowed corridors, never disturbing the grandeur of the household, yet always sustaining it. A child's day in a castle began before dawn. The stone walls were cold, the corridors dim, and the work unending. Young servants rose to fetch water from wells or streams, carrying heavy buckets through frost or mud. They swept ashes from hearths, cleaned rushes from floors, and polished metalware until it shone. In kitchens they stoked fires, chopped vegetables, plucked poultry, and turned spits of roasting meat, the heat scorching their skin, the smoke stinging their eyes. All of this was done quietly, for a servant's voice was seldom welcomed. Girls often served in chambers. They made beds stuffed with straw or feathers, scrubbed linens, fetched warm water for washing, and brushed the long hair of noble ladies. Their hands grew raw from lye soap, their backs ached from lifting. Some were scarcely older than the children they cared for, yet they bore the duties of adults without question. Boys, meanwhile, might run errands across town, polish boots, or serve as scullions in the kitchen, where they endured endless ridicule from older staff. The kitchens themselves were perilous worlds for children. Fires roared in open hearths, large enough to roast whole animals. Knives, cleavers and spits turned endlessly. Burns and cuts were constant injuries. The noise of clattering pots and barking cooks never ceased. A single mistake, dropping a dish, spilling wine, could earn a slap, a beating, or dismissal. To be dismissed was to be cast out, for servants had no safety net, no guarantee of survival beyond the walls. Above the kitchens and halls, another layer of service awaited the role of the page. Unlike scullions and maids, pages were often children of slightly higher birth, sent into noble households to learn manners, loyalty, and perhaps one day the path to knighthood. But beneath the promise of honor lay years of submission. Pages carried messages, tended to their lord's clothing and armor, waited silently at meals, and performed endless small duties designed to break pride and instill obedience. Though their future might hold advancement, their present was one of constant humility. Children serving in noble houses endured more than labor. They lived within strict hierarchies, where every mistake was magnified, every misstep punished. A dropped goblet in a feast could bring public humiliation. A forgotten task might invite harsh words or blows. Nobles demanded perfection, yet rarely acknowledged the human cost. Servants were expected to be invisible when not needed, and flawless when called upon. The danger of noble service was not only physical, but psychological. Children were stripped of voice and identity, conditioned to serve without question. They witnessed splendor they could never share. Golden goblets, silk garments, feasts overflowing with food, while their own meals were scraps from the table, stale bread, thin broth, or gnawed bones. The contrast between their hunger and the luxury around them was a daily reminder of their place. Some children found themselves serving noble children, playing companions, attendants, or caretakers. Yet even here, the line of class was never crossed. A servant child could laugh or play only when permitted, and punishment came swiftly if boundaries were forgotten. The games of noble youth were often commands to servants: fetch this, hold that, carry me. For the servant child, companionship was mingled with subservience. Friendship always fragile, authority always present. There were darker dangers too. Within stone walls, hidden from public eyes, children were vulnerable to exploitation. Power imbalances left them defenseless against cruelty, abuse, or worse. Records rarely mention these stories. Silence was enforced, voices erased, but traces survive in court documents, whispered accounts, and warnings passed down. Behind the grandeur of castles lay shadows, where children's suffering remained unseen. Yet, paradoxically, noble households also offered glimpses of opportunity. A clever servant might rise in trust, becoming a personal attendant, steward, or even tutor to younger nobles. A page who proved brave and loyal might one day be trained as a squire, beginning the long journey toward knighthood. Rarely a servant child might marry into slightly higher rank, climbing the fragile ladder of mobility. These chances were slim, but for parents sending their children into service, even the faintest hope seemed worth the risk. The rhythm of the noble household revolved around ceremony, feasts, hunts, and gatherings, required armies of unseen hands. Children carried trays through smoky halls, poured wine into goblets, and bowed silently as minstrels played and lords feasted. At night, when nobles retired to warm chambers, servants cleaned the remains, scrubbed benches, and prepared for the next day. Sleep came late, often on straw in crowded quarters beneath the grandeur above. Despite the hardship, bonds formed among servants. Children comforted one another in whispered conversations after long days, sharing scraps of bread, stolen moments of laughter, or dreams of freedom. In kitchens, they created their own rhythms, songs sung softly while kneading dough, jokes traded while scrubbing pots. These fragile connections gave strength, reminding them they were not alone within the stone silence. Guilds and contracts protected apprentices, and peasant communities supported farmers, but servants in noble houses had no such shield. Their fates depended entirely on the goodwill of masters. A kind noble could treat them with some measure of fairness, perhaps even ensuring they learned letters or basic skills. A cruel master could destroy them through neglect or punishment. Childhood, once bound to noble service, was no longer theirs to shape. Picture the grandeur of a feast: long tables laden with roasted meats, gilded goblets, tapestries gleaming in candlelight. Lords laugh, ladies whisper, music fills the air, and there, unseen by history, stand the children, pouring wine, carrying platters, bowing low. Their hands tremble with fatigue, their stomachs growl with hunger, yet their presence is invisible, erased by the brightness of nobility. Without them, the feast could not exist, yet their names are forgotten. The paradox of noble service mirrors that of all medieval child labor: exploitation and opportunity, intertwined, cruelty and kindness, balanced precariously. For some, the household was a place of survival and faint possibility. For many more, it was a place of silence, where childhood dissolved into endless duty. As dawn rose again, children carried water through frozen courtyards, swept ashes from last night's fire, and prepared for another day of unseen toil. The walls of the castle enclosed them, both protecting and imprisoning. Their world was not their own. It belonged to those above, those who feasted, those who commanded. And so, childhood in noble service became a story of shadows, silent steps along stone corridors, whispered dreams behind closed doors, invisible hands that sustained the brilliance of power. To glimpse these children is to glimpse the cost of splendor, the forgotten labor behind every shining hall. From the noble houses, our journey moves yet deeper into the medieval world, into monasteries and churches, where faith shaped children into novices and choir boys. Here danger was cloaked in devotion, and service was bound not to lords of stone, but to lords of heaven. From the echoing stone halls of noble houses, the path of childhood labor leads us into another realm, the cloisters of monasteries and abbeys. Behind high walls and heavy wooden gates, children lived under vows not of their own making. If castle service was ruled by noble power, then monastic life was governed by divine order, or at least by those who claimed to speak for it. For many families, sending a child to a monastery was a decision shaped by necessity, faith, or ambition. Some parents offered their sons or daughters to God as a pious act, believing that securing a place in the cloister would bring blessings to the family. Others sought education for their children, since monasteries were among the few centers of learning in medieval Europe, and for poor families, surrendering a child to monastic life could mean one less mouth to feed. Whatever the reason, the child rarely had a choice. Upon entering, the child was stripped of worldly identity. Clothes from home were exchanged for rough habits of wool, hair was cut, names were sometimes changed, and the past was left at the gate. From that moment, they were no longer simply children, but novices, apprentices not to a craft but to a life of prayer, discipline, and submission. Childhood within the monastery was not freedom but formation, shaping body and soul into instruments of devotion. The day of a child novice began in darkness. Bells rang before dawn, echoing through stone corridors. Sleep was broken by duty to rise, dress, and join the community in the chapel. Chant filled the cold air as young voices blended with older monks in psalms and hymns. For children, the rhythm of life was dictated by those bells, each sound marking prayer, work, study, or silence. Time itself belonged to the monastery, not to the child. Education was central, though not always gentle. Children learned Latin, the language of scripture and liturgy, painstakingly memorizing prayers and psalms. Monks drilled them in reading and chanting, correcting every slip with stern rebuke. To copy manuscripts in the scriptorium demanded patience, precision, and long hours bent over parchment, quills scratching in dim light. Mistakes were not tolerated. A smudge of ink could mean hours of punishment or rewriting. For some, this education opened doors to knowledge rarely accessible outside cloister walls. For others, it was a daily struggle against exhaustion and fear. The choir was another world of duty. Children's voices were prized for their clarity, and boys in particular were trained to sing the divine offices. Hours upon hours were spent rehearsing chant, learning melodies that stretched across generations. To sing was to worship, but also to labor. Long services meant standing for extended periods, lungs aching, throats raw. Silence was enforced between songs, discipline maintained by vigilant eyes. In those stone choirs, voices rose to heaven, but behind the music lay endless practice and relentless control. Discipline was constant. Monastic rules, such as the rule of Saint Benedict, demanded obedience, humility, and silence. For children, this meant strict punishment for even small infractions: talking at the wrong time, failing to rise quickly at bells, daydreaming during lessons. All could bring correction. Punishments ranged from extra labor to corporal discipline, for it was believed that shaping the soul required shaping the body through suffering. Fear of error became a daily companion. Work filled the hours between prayer and study. Child novices carried wood, drew water, tended gardens, and labored in kitchens. They learned to bake bread, brew ale, or care for livestock. For monasteries were self-sustaining communities. Though this work kept the monastery alive, it also consumed the energy of its youngest members. In winter, fingers froze as they hauled buckets across icy courtyards. In summer, sweat drenched their bodies as they bent to harvest crops. Holy labor was still labor, and children bore its weight as heavily as adults. Beyond physical toil lay the weight of isolation. Monasteries demanded separation from the world. Children who entered often saw their families only rarely, if ever again. Friendships within the cloister were restrained, for affection risked being labeled distraction. Silence pervaded hallways, broken only by chant and bells. For a child, the absence of laughter, play, and freedom could feel like a slow erasure of the self. Yet within these silent spaces, some found a strange comfort, a rhythm of certainty, a sense of belonging to something greater. even if that belonging was not freely chosen. Not all monastic childhoods were equal. Some abbeys offered genuine education and protection, sparing children from hunger or war beyond their walls. Learned monks taught arithmetic, scripture and philosophy, giving young novices knowledge denied to many outside. A few rose to become scholars, abbots or chroniclers, whose writings still survive today. For them monastic life, though harsh, was a pathway to influence. But for many others, it was a life of obscurity, their labor and voices consumed by the endless demands of prayer and order. Girls too were placed into convents, where nuns oversaw their training. Like their male counterparts, they learned prayers, scripture and domestic tasks. Some became scribes, illuminating manuscripts with delicate artistry. Others tended herb gardens, cared for the sick, or produced textiles for the community. But girls more than boys faced the permanence of enclosure. A convent life was often lifelong, a childhood vow, locking them away from the world outside. Their silence was deeper, their visibility even less. Monastic life also carried hidden dangers. While cloisters were meant to be sanctuaries, not all were safe. Accounts survive of harsh punishments, emotional neglect, and even abuse within cloister walls. The imbalance of power left children vulnerable, and their voices rarely carried beyond the gates. To challenge authority was unthinkable, for authority claimed divine sanction. Thus many endured in silence, their struggles buried beneath the chants of worship. Yet amidst hardship, children in monasteries sometimes carved out small spaces of resilience. In gardens they found moments of peace, tending flowers or herbs under open skies. In scriptoria, they left doodles or playful sketches hidden in the margins of manuscripts, tiny rebellions preserved for centuries. During festivals, when restrictions loosened, laughter and music briefly returned, reminding them of the childhood that still lingered beneath the habit. These glimpses reveal that even in silence, the spirit of youth was never fully extinguished. Imagine a winter dawn, frost clings to cloister walls, bells toll in the cold air, and a line of children moves quietly toward the chapel. Their breath forms clouds, their sandals slap against stone, and their voices rise in chant as candles flicker in the dark. The sound is hauntingly beautiful, yet behind it lies fatigue, hunger, and longing. To hear the choir is to hear devotion, but also to hear discipline, forged through countless hours of unseen practice. Monastic childhoods remind us of the dual nature of medieval life: sanctuary and sacrifice, learning and loss. To some the cloister offered education, shelter and purpose. To others it was a prison of silence and labor. For all it was a place where childhood was reshaped into obedience, where laughter was subdued into prayer, and where every moment belonged not to the child, but to the rule of God's house. As bells rang once more, signaling another prayer, another duty, another lesson, the cycle began again. Days blended into weeks, weeks into years, until the child was no longer a novice, but a monk or nun. Their own childhood surrendered to the cloister's rhythm. The monastery had not only trained them, but absorbed them, turning their young lives into living instruments of devotion. And so in monasteries and abbeys, the story of medieval childhood takes on a solemn tone, a story of sacred chants, silent corridors, and unseen endurance. Behind the beauty of illuminated manuscripts and the haunting sound of choirs lies the forgotten truth of children who labored under vows not of their choosing. From these cloisters, our journey must next move outward again, into the dangerous world of the streets, where abandoned children, orphans and runaways, struggled for survival beneath the shadow of medieval cities. Leaving behind the cloisters of monasteries, our journey enters a world far less ordered, the streets of medieval towns and cities. Here the echo of bells was replaced by the din of markets, the clatter of hooves, and the cries of merchants hawking goods. But among the bustle and commerce lurked shadows, the forgotten children who had no family, no shelter, and no protection. These were the orphans, the abandoned and the runaways, children whose lives were not shaped by noble duty or monastic silence, but by the daily struggle to survive. The problem of abandoned children was widespread across medieval Europe. Poverty, disease and war made childhood fragile, and when families could no longer feed their young, some children were cast out into the streets. In desperate times, mothers left infants at the doors of churches, convents, or wealthy households, praying someone would take pity. In larger cities, institutions known as foundling hospitals eventually appeared, but in the earlier centuries, most abandoned children simply had to fend for themselves. For every child taken in, countless others slipped through the cracks, becoming invisible wanderers in the crowded alleys. For some, survival meant joining groups of other homeless children. Bands of young beggars haunted markets and church steps, their hands outstretched, their eyes trained to catch the gaze of passers-by. Begging was both a skill and a stigma. Children learned to cry convincingly, to display wounds or hunger dramatically, or to sing for coins. The more pitiable the display, the greater the chance of survival. Yet pity was unpredictable. Some days, a kind soul offered bread. Other days the same children were beaten or driven away with curses. To live by begging was to gamble daily with human mercy. Hunger was relentless. When begging failed, children turned to theft. Market stalls overflowed with tempting food, apples, loaves of bread, wheels of cheese, but stealing meant risk. Markets were watched closely, and thieves caught in the act faced brutal punishment. For a child, the consequences could be whipping, branding, or being locked in stocks for public shame. Yet many still took the risk, for an empty stomach often screamed louder than fear. Some became adept pickpockets, slipping through crowds with nimble fingers, vanishing before cries of thief could bring pursuit. Street children also offered their labor in exchange for scraps. They carried buckets of water, swept shop floors, or ran errands for merchants. Payment was meager, often only leftovers from the table, or a place to sleep in a stable. Work was uncertain, and children competed fiercely for even the smallest task. Those too young or weak to labor often became servants to older children, sharing in what little food or protection the group could gather. Survival forged hierarchies, and loyalty was often bound by necessity rather than affection. Runaways added another layer to this hidden population. Some fled abusive masters, escaping from apprenticeships that had promised training but delivered only cruelty. Others ran from families they could no longer endure, or from villages destroyed by war. To run away was to step into uncertainty, but for many uncertainty was preferable to certain suffering. These children blended into the shadows of cities, nameless and rootless, their stories lost unless they left traces in the records of courts or parishes. The streets were not merely dangerous because of hunger or cold, they were also dangerous because of people. Vulnerable children were easy prey for exploitation. Some were forced into servitude, traded for labor, or worse. Girls in particular risked being drawn into the margins of society as victims of exploitation and abuse. The lack of protection made street life not only harsh, but perilous, turning every encounter into a gamble between kindness and cruelty. Authorities viewed street children with suspicion. To city officials, bands of orphans and beggars were not only pitiable, but also disruptive. They were seen as breeding grounds for crime, disorder, and disease. Laws were enacted to drive them out of marketplaces, forbid begging, or punish theft severely. But without alternatives, children returned again and again, caught in cycles of hunger and punishment. Efforts at charity existed. Almsgiving was a duty for the wealthy, yet charity was inconsistent and never enough to meet the scale of suffering. Some children found refuge in guilds or workshops, apprenticed into crafts despite lacking family support. Others entered the households of merchants as servants, exchanging freedom for security, but many never escaped the streets. For them, survival meant constant adaptation, sleeping in doorways, scavenging from refuse, or following pilgrims to holy shrines in hopes of alms. Every day was improvisation, every night, uncertainty. Childhood was shortened by necessity, replaced by the instincts of survival. Yet within this grim landscape, there were flashes of resilience. Children created their own communities, finding companionship among others in the same plight. They shared food, warned of danger, and formed small bands for protection. Songs, jokes, and games still surfaced in the cracks of hardship, reminders that even in misery, the spark of childhood could not be wholly extinguished. These fleeting joys were fragile, but they gave meaning to lives otherwise ruled by hunger and fear. The presence of street children was so common that they seeped into the art, literature, and chronicles of the age. Writers described them as both pitiable, innocents, and dangerous nuisances. Sermons urged the faithful to see Christ in the faces of starving children, while city officials recorded their crimes with cold precision. They appear in court rolls as petty thieves, in parish registers as nameless foundlings, in illuminated manuscripts as small figures hovering at the edges of scenes, always present, yet rarely heard in their own voices. Imagine a medieval marketplace at dusk. The stalls are closing, the last buyers hurrying home, and shadows lengthen across cobblestones. A child lingers near a bread stand, eyes fixed on a crust left behind. With a quick motion, the bread is snatched, and the child disappears into the maze of alleys. Behind the act lies not malice, but hunger, not rebellion, but survival. Multiply this scene by hundreds, and you glimpse the hidden population that haunted every medieval city, children who lived by instinct, not by choice. For some the streets were not the end, but the beginning of new paths. A few rose from poverty through sheer luck, or the rare kindness of strangers. Foundling children, taken in by wealthy patrons, sometimes rose to prominence, their origins hidden or forgotten. Others joined wandering groups of performers, learning to juggle, dance or play music, turning survival into performance. But these were exceptions, not the rule. For most the streets offered only a lifetime of struggle, cut short by disease, injury, or the unrelenting weight of poverty. Street children embody the harshest truths of medieval childhood. They were not protected by noble walls, not guided by monastic bells, not sheltered by family hearths. They lived exposed, vulnerable, and unseen, their existence a constant negotiation between survival and disappearance. Yet they also reveal the resilience of youth, the ability to endure in the face of overwhelming odds. Their stories remind us that medieval society was not only built by kings, knights, or monks, but also shaped by the countless children whose lives flickered in the margins. As our journey continues, we turn from the open streets to another hidden space, the workshops and guild halls, where children entered the world of apprenticeships, a path that promised training and skill, but often delivered long years of toil under strict masters. From the chaos of the streets, where survival was precarious and freedom came at a high cost, many children longed for stability. One of the most common paths that promised security, at least in theory, was the apprenticeship system. To become an apprentice was to step into the vast world of trades and crafts that underpinned medieval society: blacksmithing, weaving, shoemaking, masonry, carpentry, and countless other skills that built the backbone of daily life. Apprenticeships were not merely about learning, they were contracts that bound children to masters, shaping their lives for years. Apprenticeship often began early, sometimes as young as 7 or 8 years old. Parents, hoping to secure a future for their child, negotiated with a local master. A written contract might be drawn up, often witnessed by members of the guild or parish, outlining the length of service, the responsibilities of both child and master, and the eventual rewards. In exchange for years of labor, the child would learn a trade, receive food and lodging, and if fortunate, gain the chance to one day become a master craftsman. For poor families, sending a child into apprenticeship could mean one less mouth to feed, and the hope of future independence for their offspring. On the surface, apprenticeships seemed like a lifeline, a bridge between poverty and self-sufficiency. But in reality, they were grueling and often exploitative. Once bound to a master, the child's freedom effectively ended. The master was not only teacher, but also guardian, disciplinarian, and employer. A strict hierarchy governed daily life, with apprentices at the very bottom. They woke early, performed chores before beginning any real craft work, and labored late into the night, if the master demanded it. Tasks ranged from carrying heavy loads to cleaning the workshop, stoking fires, mixing dyes, or preparing raw materials. The actual skills of the trade might be introduced slowly, almost grudgingly, over years. Training was as much about discipline as it was about craft. Masters expected absolute obedience. Disobedience or laziness could be punished harshly, sometimes with physical beatings, sometimes with humiliation in front of peers. For children accustomed to freedom, whether in the countryside or the streets, the regimented life of apprenticeship could feel like a prison. Yet masters defended these methods as necessary to mold boys, and occasionally girls, into disciplined workers. The line between training and exploitation blurred easily, and many apprentices found themselves serving more as cheap labor than as students of a craft. The length of service varied, but was often long. 7 years was a common term, though some contracts stretched to 10. During this period, apprentices were forbidden to marry, forbidden to leave without permission, and often restricted from visiting their families. They lived in the household of the master, sharing the space with the master's family and other servants. This arrangement blurred the boundary between family and servitude. Some masters treated apprentices almost like adopted children, feeding them well, teaching diligently, and showing care. Others treated them as outsiders, barely more than servants bound by legal chains. Guilds oversaw much of this system. In towns and cities, guilds controlled trades, guarded secrets of craftsmanship, and enforced standards. They also mediated disputes between masters and apprentices. But guilds were not impartial protectors of children. They existed to protect the interests of masters and the quality of the craft. If an apprentice complained of abuse or neglect, guild officials might intervene, but far more often they sided with the master, unless the abuse was extreme. Apprentices were expected to endure hardship as part of their training. Daily life in a workshop reflected the rhythm of labor. Imagine a boy apprenticed to a blacksmith. The roar of the forge, the glow of heated iron, the constant hammering shaping tools and weapons. His day might begin before dawn, gathering coal, carrying water, and preparing materials. Only later would he be allowed to strike metal himself, guided or scolded by his master. Or picture a girl apprenticed to a weaver, her fingers learning to thread the loom, while her back ached from hours of work. Apprenticeship was not glamorous. It was repetition, discipline, and endurance. Exploitation was common. Masters often used apprentices for household work unrelated to the craft, cleaning floors, tending animals, or serving meals. Some were overworked to exhaustion, given only the barest necessities of food and shelter. Others suffered neglect, beaten for mistakes, or left untrained even after years of service. When apprentices fell ill, they were sometimes discarded, returned to families, or simply abandoned. For poor children, there was little recourse. They had no power to challenge the authority of their masters. Despite the hardships, apprenticeship remained one of the only pathways to skilled work. At the end of their term, if they survived and learned well, apprentices could graduate to become journeymen, workers who traveled to find employment and perfect their skills. With time savings and luck, a journeyman might one day become a master, open a workshop, and take apprentices of their own. For some, this ascent brought prosperity and status. Guild membership carried respect and influence, a far cry from the insecurity of childhood poverty, yet only a fraction reached this stage. Many apprentices never advanced beyond the lowest rungs, trapped in perpetual labor. The emotional toll of apprenticeship was profound. For children separated from their families, loneliness could be overwhelming. They were surrounded by adults who demanded labor, by other apprentices who might be rivals, and by guild structures that valued obedience above individuality. Friendships formed, of course, and some found mentors who truly cared. But for many, the years of apprenticeship were remembered less as training and more as survival within a rigid, often harsh system. One cannot ignore the role of gender in this system. While most apprentices were boys, some trades allowed for female apprentices, particularly in textiles, brewing, or midwifery. Girls faced unique vulnerabilities. They were often paid less, offered fewer chances at advancement, and were at risk of exploitation in households where power imbalances left them unprotected. Some rose to skill and independence, but many remained invisible, their labor hidden beneath the authority of their male counterparts. The apprenticeship system reflected the duality of medieval life. On one hand, it preserved crafts, passed down skills, and gave structure to children's lives. It prevented some from descending into crime or destitution, offering at least the hope of advancement. On the other hand, it often consumed childhood, replacing play and freedom with years of servitude. Apprenticeship was at once opportunity and exploitation, discipline and drudgery, promise and disappointment. Imagine the moment when a young apprentice finally completed his term. After 7 years of service, he stood before the guild, presenting a finished piece, his masterwork, to prove his skill. If accepted, he was free to seek work as a journeyman, no longer bound to his master. The sense of release, of finally stepping into manhood after years of toil, must have been immense. Yet how many actually reached this moment? For every success story, countless others ended with broken contracts, abuse, or lifelong servitude. Apprenticeships shaped not only the lives of children, but also the economy of towns and cities. Without child labor, workshops could not function, and without the system of apprenticeship, crafts could not survive. Yet the cost was borne by the young, who gave their formative years to masters and guilds. Their sweat, their obedience, and their endurance became the foundation of medieval industry. As we move forward, we leave the workshops and guild halls to enter a world even more perilous. The fields and streets, where children were employed in hazardous labor. For while apprenticeship promised a future, many children had no such prospects. Their work was dangerous from the very start, exposing them to risks that claimed lives before adulthood could ever be reached. If apprenticeship was a system that at least promised skill and advancement, then the world of hazardous labor was its dark mirror. Here children were not bound by contracts of learning, nor were they overseen by guilds that demanded proper training. Instead, they were thrown directly into the most dangerous and grueling forms of work medieval society had to offer. Mills, mines, and fields absorbed countless children, consuming their energy, their health, and often their very lives. For the poor, this was not a choice but a necessity. Hunger drove them into danger long before adulthood, and survival meant labor in conditions that few grown men could endure. The first stop on this descent into danger is the mill. At first glance, a watermill or windmill might not seem so perilous. These structures, often looming on the landscape with their turning sails or rushing water wheels, were symbols of progress and ingenuity. Yet inside they were machines of constant motion, powered by forces children could barely comprehend. Millstones ground relentlessly, gears turned with unstoppable force, and belts or shafts whirred in dangerous proximity to small hands and feet. Children were often employed as assistants to millers, tasked with carrying sacks of grain, feeding hoppers, or cleaning equipment. The work was exhausting and physically demanding, but the greater danger came from the machines themselves. A moment's distraction could be fatal. Stories survive of children crushed beneath falling sacks, mangled in gears or suffocated in flour dust. The fine powder filled lungs, making breathing difficult, and leaving apprentices and helpers coughing violently after long hours. Dust mixed with damp air to form a choking haze, and in enclosed mills, fires could erupt unexpectedly. The combination of physical strain and hidden peril made the mill a place of constant threat. Yet families lined up for the chance to have their children employed there, because wages, however meager, were still more than nothing. If mills represented mechanical danger, then mines were the very embodiment of human exploitation. Mining in the medieval period was grueling for adults, but for children, it was often a death sentence. From England's tin mines to Germany's silver veins and Hungary's gold pits, children descended into the earth to haul ore, carry water, and squeeze into tunnels too narrow for grown men. Their small bodies were an advantage to employers who needed workers able to crawl through cramped shafts, but that advantage came at an unbearable cost. Life underground was suffocating. Darkness was broken only by flickering torches that smoked and sputtered. Air was thin, damp, and heavy with dust that clung to lungs and eyes. The constant dripping of water echoed like a grim reminder of the weight of earth pressing above. Children carried heavy loads on their backs or in crude baskets, stumbling along uneven passages with only hope to guide them. Accidents were frequent. Cave-ins crushed entire teams. Floods swept through tunnels without warning. Poisonous fumes, invisible and silent, stole breath and life before cries for help could reach the surface. The toll on young bodies was devastating. Spines twisted under the weight of loads, knees and joints wore down from endless crouching, and lungs blackened from dust and smoke. Many never lived to see adulthood, Those who did often bore the scars of their labor, hunchbacks, chronic illness, and bodies broken long before their time. To the wealthy, mines produced glittering treasure, silver coins for kings, iron for weapons, salt for trade. To the poor children who toiled within them, mines produced only exhaustion and despair. And yet, for all their danger, mines were not the most common workplace for children. That distinction belonged to the fields. Agriculture was the backbone of medieval life, and in the endless cycle of sowing, tending and harvesting, children played a crucial role. If mines, mills and fields were the harsh crucibles of survival for the poor, then the noble household was its polished counterpart, a place of refinement, order and opportunity. Yet appearances can be deceiving. Behind the stone walls of castles and the timber halls of manor houses, children lived lives that were structured, disciplined, and demanding. Some entered these households as pages or companions to noble heirs, destined for futures in knighthood or administration. Others came as servants, fulfilling roles not of privilege but of duty, their childhoods consumed by endless labor within glittering halls. To understand medieval childhood fully, one must step inside these noble domains, where service was both a ladder of opportunity and a burden of obligation. The role of the page was perhaps the most iconic form of noble service. Typically, boys of noble or aspiring families were sent away at the age of 7 or 8 to serve in the household of a greater lord. This was more than custom, it was strategy. By placing their sons in the service of powerful families, parents secured alliances, education, and the promise of advancement. For the boys themselves, life as a page was rigorous and often overwhelming. A page's day began at dawn. He was expected to rise quickly, dress properly, and be ready to assist his lord or lady. Duties included carrying messages, serving at table, and attending on guests. Pages also learned courtly manners, memorizing the elaborate codes of deference that defined noble life: how to bow, how to speak, how to hold a goblet. Every gesture carried meaning, and mistakes could bring humiliation. Yet alongside service, pages received training. They learned the rudiments of literacy, practiced music, and above all were introduced to the martial skills that would prepare them for knighthood. Swordplay, horsemanship, and hunting were woven into their education. To the modern eye, the life of a page might appear privileged compared to the brutal existence of field laborers, and indeed pages had access to fine clothing, rich food, and exposure to culture. But this privilege came at the cost of freedom. They were always under scrutiny, always expected to perform. Missteps could bring severe punishment, for noble households valued discipline above indulgence. A boy of noble birth might serve in splendor, but he was still a servant, bound to the will of those above him. For girls, the path into noble service was different, but no less demanding. Many were sent as attendants or ladies in waiting, placed under the care of noble women who trained them in household management, etiquette, and the skills of running estates. They learned sewing, embroidery, music, and the delicate arts of conversation and diplomacy. But just as with boys, their lives were defined by service. A girl might spend hours dressing her mistress, preparing her chamber, or running errands through the labyrinthine corridors of the castle. In return, she absorbed the culture of nobility, lessons in refinement that would prepare her for a marriage arranged to benefit her family's status. Yet noble households were not filled only with pages and attendants of high birth. Many children of humbler origins found themselves serving as domestic workers, employed to cook, clean, fetch water, and tend animals within the estate. Their work was unglamorous, but essential. A great lord's household was a world unto itself, often employing dozens or even hundreds of servants to maintain its daily rhythm. Children, with their energy and obedience, made up a large portion of this labor force. The tasks of servant children were varied. Some worked in kitchens, rising before dawn to light fires, grind grain, or scrub pots. Others carried water from wells or rivers, a back-breaking task requiring dozens of trips each day. Still others swept halls, polished armor, or ran messages between chambers. While noble children serving as pages could at least anticipate advancement, these servant children had little hope beyond a lifetime of labor. Theirs was a world of strict hierarchy, where disobedience could be met with beatings, and invisibility was their greatest protection. Despite these differences, all children in noble households shared one thing: the constant pressure of discipline. Medieval lords demanded efficiency, and their households functioned as carefully controlled machines. Children were drilled in obedience from dawn to dusk, learning to anticipate orders before they were given. Whether a noble page practicing swordplay or a kitchen boy hauling water, all were part of the same hierarchy, contributing to the grandeur and stability of the household. There were, however, advantages to this life. Children serving in noble households were often better fed than their peasant counterparts. They lived indoors, shielded from the worst of weather, and they gained exposure to culture, language, and connections that might one day prove useful. For some, service truly was a ladder. A clever servant might rise to become a trusted steward. A page who excelled could become a knight. Even girls in service could secure advantageous marriages through the networks they formed. The household was both a cage and a stage, limiting freedom yet offering chances for those who could navigate its demands. But one must not romanticize this too much. For every page who became a knight, many more remained stuck in service, their childhoods consumed by tasks they had no choice but to perform. For every attendant who married well, others spent their lives as perpetual servants. And for those of low birth, the noble household was less a place of opportunity than a lifetime of toil, wrapped in the glitter of aristocratic splendor. The social contrasts within the household itself could be striking. A young lord's son, barely 10 years old, might be practicing sword drills in the courtyard, encouraged by tutors and cheered by attendants. Meanwhile, another child of the same age scrubbed the floors of that very courtyard, ignored by all save the overseer, who barked orders. Both were children, yet their destinies were divided by birth. Such juxtapositions remind us that medieval childhood was not a single experience, but many, each shaped by the invisible lines of class and opportunity. Daily life in these households also reflected the broader rhythms of medieval society. Children took part in feast days, assisting in great halls lit by torches and filled with music. They witnessed tournaments, processions and ceremonies, experiences that etched deep impressions on their young minds. Yet for all the spectacle, their role was always the same: to serve, to learn and to obey. The noble household was in its essence a school of discipline. It trained children to fulfill the roles society demanded of them: knights, ladies, stewards, or lifelong servants. It provided structure and opportunity, but little space for play or leisure. Childhood in this environment was less about innocence and more about preparation, every day shaping the adult the child was expected to become. As we step away from the great halls and castle chambers, we see how service in noble households was both a privilege and a burden. For some it opened doors to advancement, for others it was a trap from which there was no escape. But whether noble or humble, page or servant, all who served in these households were bound by the same truth: their childhood was not their own, but belonged to the household, to its hierarchy, and to the expectations of a world that demanded obedience above all. In the next section, we will turn to another crucial aspect of medieval childhood: education and literacy. Here children stepped beyond service and labor to enter the realm of learning, where monasteries, schools and tutors shaped not just workers and servants, but thinkers, clerks and scribes. Education, though rare, offered a different kind of hope, and it is to this fragile promise of knowledge that we now turn. While many children of medieval Europe were bound to labor in fields, mines, workshops, or noble households, a small but significant number were granted access to education, a path that opened entirely different possibilities. Education in the medieval world was not universal. For most, childhood meant survival, work, and obedience. Yet within monasteries, cathedral schools and private households, some children discovered books, lessons, and the world of literacy. Here childhood could be shaped not only by labor and obedience, but by knowledge, curiosity, and intellectual discipline. Monasteries were the earliest and most important centers of learning. Boys, often from noble families, were sent to live within monastic communities, to receive instruction in reading, writing, and religious doctrine. The monastery itself was a world apart. Silent corridors, lined with stone candlelit scriptoriums, filled with the faint smell of ink, and the rhythmic chanting of monks marking the passage of hours. In this environment, children learned Latin, the language of the church and scholarship, as well as arithmetic, music, and sometimes rudimentary sciences. Education was deeply intertwined with religious instruction, for the church considered literacy both a spiritual and practical necessity. For many children, monastic education was both rigorous and disciplined. The day began with prayers and continued with lessons, copying manuscripts and reciting texts aloud. Memorization was key. Students repeated psalms, prayers and passages from the Bible until they were committed to memory. Writing was painstaking work, for the materials themselves were precious. Parchment was expensive, quills needed constant sharpening, and ink was both scarce and easily spilled. A simple mistake could waste hours of effort, yet the children endured, developing not only literacy, but patience, focus, and dexterity. Outside monasteries, cathedral schools offered education to those preparing for clerical or administrative careers. These schools were more urban, often attached to great churches, and drew students from a wider range of social classes. Here children learned reading, writing and arithmetic, but also rhetoric, philosophy, and law. Instruction was conducted in Latin, which connected them to a broader European intellectual culture. The focus on reasoning, debate, and memorization trained children not only to read and write, but to think critically, at least by the standards of their age and era. Private tutors were another avenue of learning, particularly for noble children. Wealthy households employed tutors to teach reading, writing, foreign languages, music, and courtly manners. Education became a mark of status, and mastery of letters and etiquette was essential for social advancement. A child educated by a private tutor could aspire to roles in administration, diplomacy, or the clergy. Education was both a shield and a sword. It offered protection from manual labor and provided the tools to navigate the complex hierarchies of medieval society. Yet, education was rarely easy or free of pressure. Discipline remained central. Tutors and monks demanded obedience, punctuality, and diligence. Mistakes were corrected with scoldings, and sometimes corporal punishment was employed. Lessons were intense, often hours of study and memorization each day. Sleep was measured, and leisure was minimal. The pursuit of knowledge required focus, and children had to develop resilience to thrive within these demanding schedules. Access to education also depended heavily on gender and social class. Boys, particularly those from noble or wealthy families, had far greater access than girls. Girls who were educated often did so in convent schools or under private tutelage, learning reading, writing, and domestic skills, but rarely the same breadth of subjects offered to boys. Social class dictated both the quality and the duration of instruction, creating stark contrasts. A peasant child might labor from dawn to dusk with no hope of literacy, while a noble boy practiced Latin, music, and fencing within richly furnished chambers. Despite these limitations, literacy was transformative. For those who learned to read and write, the world expanded beyond the confines of labor or domestic service. Books, letters, and manuscripts became tools of communication, administration, and personal development. Literacy allowed children to record history, correspond across distances, and participate in the broader cultural life of their society. For some it became a path to influence. Clergy, scribes, lawyers, and administrators all relied on literacy to ascend socially and professionally. The act of learning itself also cultivated patience and mental discipline. Children copied texts painstakingly, letter by letter, learning not only language, but meticulous attention to detail. Music lessons taught rhythm, focus, and memory. Arithmetic exercises sharpened logic and problem-solving skills. Even the seemingly small lessons, how to hold a quill, how to recite a psalm, instilled habits of diligence and reflection. In this way, education was not only intellectual but deeply formative for character. Imagine a young boy in a cathedral school, seated at a long wooden bench, quill in hand, parchment spread before him. The teacher recites lines from a psalm, and the boy repeats them in careful cadence. Candles flicker around the room, illuminating rows of other children, each absorbed in their studies. Outside, the city hums with life, but inside there is only focus, repetition, and quiet determination. These children, though young, were building the foundations of skills and understanding that could last a lifetime. Monastic and scholarly education also introduced children to the stories and knowledge of previous generations. They copied manuscripts of classical authors, studied religious texts, and explored histories of kings, battles, and saints. Knowledge became a bridge to the past, connecting them to centuries of human experience. This intellectual inheritance was rare in a society dominated by manual labor, and those who gained it carried a kind of privilege, a glimpse of a world beyond immediate survival. Yet even within these centers of learning, childhood was still constrained. Discipline, hierarchy, and expectation remained omnipresent. Children were evaluated, constantly corrected, and guided according to strict rules. Mistakes were rarely forgiven lightly, and leisure was minimal. The pressure to perform and the demand for obedience mirrored, in some ways, the laborious world of apprentices and servants. The difference was in the medium. Here work was intellectual rather than physical, yet it was no less consuming. The opportunity to gain education was intertwined with the opportunity to survive. Many children, especially those from poor families, could attend only if their labor was somehow offset, helping in the monastery, performing errands, or assisting tutors. Education was rarely a luxury without responsibility. Even learning was a form of work, and the line between child and servant remained faint. Yet for those who persevered, the rewards were profound. Literacy and knowledge offered paths to safety, influence, and social mobility that were otherwise unavailable. Education in medieval Europe, therefore, was both a gift and a challenge. It was a rare window of opportunity that allowed children to transcend the limitations of their birth and environment. Yet it demanded immense discipline, patience, and resilience. For a child in a monastery, a cathedral school, or under a private tutor, learning became a central part of life, a structured, rigorous, and transformative experience that shaped both mind and character. As we leave the world of books, quills, and lessons, we can see the full spectrum of medieval childhood, from the harsh survival of street children and field laborers, to the structured service in noble households, to the disciplined pursuit of knowledge. Each path reveals the remarkable resilience of children and the diverse ways they navigated the demands, dangers, and opportunities of their world. In the next section, we will turn to childhood in war and military service, where boys were drawn into battles, campaigns, and the harsh realities of combat, facing perils that could end life or limb before they even reached adulthood. Medieval warfare was a reality that affected every level of society, and children were far from exempt. From the sprawling castles of nobility to the smallest village militia, boys were drawn into the machinery of war, at an age when play and learning should have been their primary concerns. Some entered the battlefield as pages or squires, training in the arts of arms alongside knights, while others were pressed into militias, serving as auxiliaries, or even combatants in local conflicts. For them, childhood was inseparable from danger, and survival depended on courage, obedience, and endurance. For boys of noble birth, service in war often began in preparation long before actual combat. Pages and squires learned weapons handling, horsemanship, and strategy under the watchful eyes of seasoned knights. Their training was exacting, designed to cultivate strength, skill, and discipline. Sword drills, lance exercises, and mock battles were daily routines, sometimes leaving bruises, sprains, and exhaustion in their wake. While these experiences could be framed as preparation for future honor and status, the physical demands were intense, and the risk of injury ever present. The battlefield itself was even harsher. During campaigns, boys served as messengers, assistants, and camp helpers, carrying provisions, tending to wounded soldiers, and maintaining equipment. Some were tasked with leading horses, managing baggage, or delivering orders across chaotic and dangerous terrain. Others, particularly older adolescents, found themselves drawn directly into combat. The clash of weapons, the roar of battle, and the ever-present threat of injury or death became the backdrop of their daily existence. For children pressed into militias, particularly in times of local unrest or invasions, the dangers were immediate and indiscriminate. Unlike noble pages or squires, These boys often had no formal training or protection. They carried spears, shields, or rudimentary weapons and faced enemies whose experience and strength dwarfed their own. Casualties were high and injuries frequent. Even surviving a single battle left lasting physical and psychological scars. The medieval concept of childhood, in these circumstances, was largely irrelevant. Survival demanded performance and courage beyond years. The psychological impact of warfare on children was profound. Witnessing death, destruction, and the suffering of comrades or civilians instilled trauma that could linger a lifetime. The fear, the adrenaline, and the constant vigilance required in a war zone left little room for play, reflection, or emotional rest. For many, these early experiences of conflict shaped their personalities, temperaments, and expectations of the world. Childhood in this context became a crucible, forging resilience, but exacting a severe cost. Many children also served as camp followers, supporting armies in roles essential but perilous. They cooked, cleaned, carried water, and maintained supplies, often near battle lines. Disease, starvation, and exposure were constant threats. Tents offered little protection from the elements, and food was scarce. Children were expected to work tirelessly, sometimes for days without rest, their small bodies and nimble hands making them uniquely suited for these tasks. Yet the same youth that allowed them to perform these duties also made them vulnerable to fatigue, illness, and injury. Despite the risks, some children found opportunities within military service. For those of noble birth, service as a squire or page could lead to knighthood, social advancement, and prestige. For others, demonstrating bravery, skill, or reliability could secure positions of trust within the army or household. These successes, however rare, were the exceptions in a world dominated by hardship, danger, and mortality. For most, war was a gauntlet through which they passed unwillingly, driven by obligation, survival, or societal expectation. Campaigns and sieges were especially perilous for children. Castles under attack were dangerous places, with falling stones, fire, and combatants pressing in every direction. Boys tasked with carrying messages or maintaining fortifications faced constant risk. Their small size allowed them to navigate spaces that adults could not, but it also left them exposed and defenseless if caught in the crossfire. Siege engines, catapults, and defensive mechanisms became deadly obstacles. Survival required vigilance, agility, and sometimes luck. In addition to physical danger, children faced moral and emotional challenges. They were witnesses to acts of brutality, looting, and execution, and sometimes expected to participate in tasks that violated their innate sense of right and wrong. The line between necessity and cruelty was often blurred. Children internalized these experiences, shaping their understanding of authority, justice, and survival. These early encounters with moral complexity left an indelible mark, forming a harsh education in the realities of power and violence. The lives of children in war also illustrate the contrast between social classes. Noble children, trained and armored, faced danger in the context of privilege, with mentors and resources at their disposal. Common boys in militias, or conscripted into campaigns, had none of these protections. They were expendable labor, valued only for the small advantage their size and stamina could provide. The disparity highlights the inequality of medieval childhood, where birth determined both the degree of danger and the opportunities for advancement. Children's experiences in war were further complicated by mobility and displacement. Armies moved constantly, forcing children to endure long marches, exposure to weather, and hunger. They lived in camps with little sanitation, where disease spread rapidly. Fatigue, malnutrition, and infection were often as deadly as combat itself. In these conditions, every day was a test of endurance, resourcefulness, and courage. The capacity of children to adapt was remarkable, yet the cost to their bodies and minds was immense. Training for future military service was also intertwined with cultural expectations. Boys were instructed in chivalric codes, the ideals of honor, loyalty, and courage. These lessons were meant to mold them into disciplined warriors, loyal to their lords and the societal hierarchy. Yet, in practice, the brutal realities of war often contradicted these ideals. Children learned that survival sometimes required cunning, obedience, and pragmatism, rather than pure valor. The tension between ideal and reality shaped their understanding of the world. Some children, particularly those of nobility, experienced war in a more structured environment, participating in tournaments, drills and controlled skirmishes, designed to prepare them for actual combat. These exercises carried risks, but they were safer than the chaos of a battlefield. The distinction between training and real combat was subtle, and both left a lasting impression. Children learned endurance, bravery and the mechanics of warfare, but at a price. Bruises, broken bones and emotional strain were common. Even outside active combat, the threat of war shaped daily life. Villages and towns trained children in basic defense drills and weapon handling. They learned to respond to raids, fires and sudden attacks. In these contexts, childhood was inseparable from preparation for conflict, and the idea of innocence was overshadowed by necessity. Society demanded that children be ready, adaptable, and resilient, qualities often forged in fear, fatigue, and hardship. As we leave behind the battlefields, we see that war defined childhood for countless children in medieval Europe. Their bodies endured violence, their minds absorbed trauma, and their days were shaped by survival and duty. Some found opportunity, honor, or skill, but for most war was an inescapable trial, a world in which play, leisure, and carefree learning were luxuries beyond reach. Childhood, in this sense, was not a sanctuary, but a stage on which the harsh realities of society were played out. In the next and final section, we will reflect on the legacy of medieval childhood, how these experiences, ranging from labor and service to education and war, shaped not only individual lives, but the society they inhabited. We will consider the resilience, adaptation, and human spirit that persisted despite the many dangers and demands placed on the young. As we look back across the varied experiences of medieval children, from laboring in fields and mines to serving in noble households, from learning in monasteries and schools to enduring the perils of war, a remarkable truth emerges. Childhood in this era was defined not by leisure or play, but by resilience, adaptation, and survival. Every day presented a new set of demands, dangers, and expectations, yet children navigated them with a tenacity that speaks to the extraordinary human capacity to endure and learn, even under the harshest circumstances. For many, survival itself was the central concern. In a world of scarcity and social stratification, children's labor was essential to family and community life. Fieldwork, mining, domestic service, and industrial tasks were not mere chores. They were necessary for sustenance and security. Despite exhaustion, injury, and the constant threat of danger, children fulfilled these roles with remarkable persistence. Their contributions, often invisible in historical records, sustained medieval economies and households. Without the labor, obedience, and skill of young people, the machinery of society, from agriculture to trade to aristocratic households, would have faltered. At the same time, medieval childhood was a crucible of learning and skill development. Even in the most grueling circumstances, children acquired knowledge, technique, and expertise that would serve them throughout their lives. Apprenticeships, service in households, and work in the fields or workshops taught practical skills from animal husbandry and metallurgy to literacy and administration. Education, whether formal or informal, instilled habits of attention, diligence, and endurance. The lessons of childhood extended far beyond academic knowledge. They were lessons in observation, adaptation, and resilience, qualities that defined both individual lives and the broader society. The contrast between childhoods across social classes was stark. Noble children, trained as pages or scribes, experienced structure, discipline, and opportunities for advancement. Poor children, laboring in mills, mines, and fields, faced the raw hardships of survival. Yet in both cases, the demands on young lives were intense. Childhood for medieval boys and girls alike was rarely a time of indulgence. Rather, it was a period in which society imposed its expectations, trained its future participants, and required contributions to the survival and success of family, household, or kingdom. Education and literacy offered one form of escape and empowerment. For those fortunate enough to receive instruction, the ability to read, write, and think critically opened doors to careers in the clergy, administration, or scholarship. Literacy allowed children to record knowledge, communicate across distances, and participate in the cultural life of their society. Even for those whose formal education was brief or incomplete, the skills learned in monastic, cathedral, or household settings provided a foundation for navigating a complex social world. Knowledge became a tool of agency, offering both protection and opportunity in ways that manual labor alone could not. War, danger, and service left indelible marks as well. Children who experienced battle, sieges, or campaigns learned courage, vigilance, and the weight of responsibility at an age far younger than we might imagine today. Physical skills, tactical understanding, and moral lessons in loyalty and honor were combined with the psychological burdens of trauma, loss, and exposure to violence. These experiences, while harsh, produced resilience and practical knowledge that shaped adult identity. Medieval children were in essence apprenticed to life itself, learning to survive and adapt under conditions that modern childhood rarely encounters. Another significant legacy of medieval childhood is the cultivation of social bonds. Shared labor, service, and education fostered cooperation and camaraderie among children. Bonds formed in workshops, fields, and households often provided crucial emotional support and companionship. In times of scarcity, danger, or conflict, these relationships could mean the difference between survival and despair. Friendship, mentorship, and solidarity were integral to navigating the challenges of a world in which children were simultaneously vulnerable and essential. The inequality of experience also left lasting societal effects. Children's lives were shaped profoundly by birth, class, and circumstance. Noble children, with access to education, service, and protection, were groomed for leadership and influence. Poor children, forced into labor or conscription, developed resilience and skill, but often had little opportunity for advancement or recognition. These disparities reinforced social hierarchies, yet they also ensured that the contributions of children, across every level of society, were vital to the functioning and continuity of medieval life. Medieval childhood also reveals the interplay of vulnerability and agency. While children were often subject to the demands of adults, they were not merely passive participants. In labor, service, and even education, they exercised skill, judgment, and initiative. They learned to navigate the expectations of authority, adapt to changing circumstances, and find small measures of autonomy within rigid structures. The agency of medieval children, though constrained, demonstrates that even in the harshest conditions, young people shaped their own experiences, contributing to the resilience of families, households, and communities. Perhaps most striking is the cumulative human capacity for endurance. Across centuries and across regions, children faced physical labor, social hierarchy, disease, warfare, and limited freedom. Yet they persisted. They learned, they served, they fought, and they survived. Their experiences, while harsh, produced not only resilience, but also knowledge, skill, and cultural continuity. The legacy of medieval childhood is above all a testament to human adaptability, the ability to endure difficulty, acquire competence, and carry forward the lifeways, traditions, and skills of their society. Even when reflecting on suffering, hardship, and mortality, the stories of medieval children reveal hope and persistence. They remind us that childhood, while constrained, was also a time of growth, learning, and social contribution. In the fields, mills, and mines, they sustained economies. In noble households, they navigated hierarchy and acquired skills. In monasteries and schools, they accessed knowledge and culture. In war, they faced danger and developed courage. Each sphere, while demanding, contributed to the development of individual capability and collective resilience. These experiences shaped the adults they would become. Laboring children grew into skilled artisans, farmers, or household managers. Educated children entered the clergy, administration, or courts. Those who survived military service carried lessons in strategy, endurance, and leadership. The foundation laid in childhood, often forged under pressure, risk, and expectation, influenced society as a whole, sustaining economies, governance, culture, and social order. The echo of medieval childhood resonated through the structures, skills and traditions of Europe for generations. Finally, the story of medieval childhood invites reflection on human persistence in adversity. It challenges modern perceptions of childhood as a time of ease, highlighting instead the extraordinary capacities of young people to adapt, endure, and contribute meaningfully to their world. Their lives, though constrained, were active, productive, and formative. The resilience, resourcefulness, and skill cultivated in these years created a foundation not only for individual survival but for societal continuity. As we close this exploration, it becomes clear that the legacy of medieval childhood is both universal and enduring. The challenges faced, the lessons learned, and the resilience demonstrated resonate beyond the centuries, offering a profound testament to the strength of the human spirit. From the humblest laborer to the most privileged page, from the classroom to the battlefield, children shaped, endured, and sustained the world around them. Their stories remind us that childhood, even in its most constrained form, is a period of remarkable capability, endurance, and quiet heroism. And so, as we leave behind the centuries of toil, learning and struggle, we carry with us an understanding of medieval childhood, not as a simple prelude to adulthood, but as a formative, dynamic, and enduring force, a mosaic of labor, service, education, and courage that shaped both individuals and the society they inherited.